Here is Colorverse Green. This is a solid basic green that gives a very basic performance. It is lighter in the writing sample than it was in the swatch. This holds with a really consistent tone across different papers and generally doesn't offer much for shading. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the performance does good enough. And since this isn't a big shader, you don't lose much using it on non-fountain pen friendly paper. If I was in the market for a basic green, I would consider this. But since I prefer my greens anything but basic, this just isn't a green for me.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Look at that tone on the very white paper. When you think green, this is the shade of green that I tend to think of. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. There's only one or two moments that there is any amount of shading, almost nothing. Numbers is probably about the only spot you really get to see it, where that M is a bit lighter than the whole word, and B is the darkest letter of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Ginkgo Tree. Here is Colorverse SM1.
Here is Colorverse Sunspot.
Here is Colorverse Dirty Red.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same basic green tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, barely shades at all. You have to look for those couple of moments that it is just a little bit lighter, like on the MU of multiplies. Otherwise, we just get a perfect basic green in color and performance. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, meaning this is unaffected by the tone of the paper that's underneath, showing this to be an opaque ink. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, barely shades at all if it decides to. Take a look at decides on the third line, where most of the word is one tone, but it's the downstroke of that D into the ES that do get a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, you can see a couple of spots that it got just a little bit deeper into the page. Ghosting's not a problem. I don't believe these spots would stop you from using this ink on both sides.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see we got the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely shades at all if it's going to do it. If you were to make a list of the shading, it would largely be empty, but not entirely empty. Like, look at empty on the second line, where the E is a little bit darker than the M, but the PTY darken up at the end. It stands out against this quad rule with no kind of problem, meaning if this is the paper that you go for, this would be a good match. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks. Here is Diamine Classic Green. Here is KWZ Midnight Green. Here is Robert Oster Moss.
Here is Tag Kayona Oto Maeglo Iro.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is noticeably lighter and flatter a green than we had on the Clairfontaine. It is no longer giving us that classic green vibe. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have some of the same moments of shading. It does stand out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. But if you as a student really wanted that true basic green, I don't know that this would be the right ink for you. If you were using this just to have a green, I think it looks really nice on this page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Van Diemen's Apricot.
Here is Sailor Studio 150.
Here is Diamine Onyx.
Here is Ancient Charm, the Phoenix.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is a light bit of feathering that occurs in just a couple of spots like this one. Not bad. It's all sensible in what's happening. There is spread that's going on, a little more spread than I would really want to see when it comes to working on copy paper. But this is a stub nib, so perhaps exasperating the problem. Hey, I got to use a fancy word. The shading does happen just a little bit, but not as any kind of a standout quality. I think with a finer nib on this paper, you would be fairly happy with what you get. Looking at the back of the page, there are some spots that get deeper into the paper, meaning you likely would not write on the back of this page, but you might get away with it if you really needed to. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Kaweco Art Sport with its stub nib usually writes very dry, but with this ink felt like it was wet, meaning it felt thicker underneath the nib, giving it a little smoother feeling in what was going on writing. It provided a generally solid green tone with generally solid performance. Off camera, I tried this in a dry fine and it changed nothing in any of the performance, not the color, not the shading, nothing. I would say that this is dealer's choice. It's obvious choice. It's an obvious choice for this ink. You get to put it in your favorite pen and enjoy knowing what you're going to get every single time.